Today's sermon is titled, No Good Deed. And if you've ever heard the expression, no good deed goes unpunished, then you might have some clue kind of where this is going this morning. I mentioned last week how the Gospel of John, chapters 2 through 4, basically form what a lot of commentators refer to as the Cana cycle. And they call it that because it both begins and ends in Cana of Galilee. Those two encounters kind of bookend that whole cycle. And Jesus, at each instance, does a mighty work and a mighty wonder that proves his divinity. But then in between, we get all these stories, and the common theme of those stories is people having encounters with Jesus. And then, generally speaking, they come to saving faith in Jesus because of those encounters. And that's kind of what the Cana cycle is all about. Starting with today's sermon and starting with John chapter 5, that all changes. Okay, now we are entering a different cycle, what a lot of commentators refer to as the festival cycle, that runs from John chapter 5 all the way up to John chapter 10. And the reason it's called the festival cycle is because we see a heavy emphasis on the Jewish festivals throughout these chapters. And the theme changes. Now the theme is going to be the mounting persecution against Jesus as people begin to resist him and have problems with him, specifically the religious leaders, as they are getting more and more desperate to eliminate him. And that's what we're going to be seeing over the next several chapters. And we'll see that the primary reason that they oppose Jesus is because they're so preoccupied with their rules and their laws and their traditions and all of these things that they have made up for themselves, that they've become blinded to the actual workings of God in their midst. They're blind to when God is actually doing something because they're so preoccupied with these rules they've created. If you ever heard the name of a man named Henry Blasphemies, he actually wrote a really, really good Bible study called Experiencing God. And one of the key premises of experiencing God is how the best thing you can do as a Christ follower, the best things we can do as a church is to look for the places where God is working and then go join him there. But let him take the lead in that. Look where God is working and join him there. Join him in his work. So the question we're looking at today is, what does it take to miss out on what God is trying to do? What does it take to miss out on seeing where God is working? So we're going to look at three objections. I have found obstacles. Three obstacles in today's text that can derail you from finding where God is working. And here they are. You can be saddled by superstitions. You can be trapped by traditionalism. You can be blinded by blasphemies. I apologize for the alliteration. Sometimes I can't help it. If it's there, I take it. But there it is for you. So that's what we're looking at today. Today, if you have your Bibles with you, if you have not already, please flip them open. Join me in the Gospel of John, chapter 5. We're reading today from verses 1 through 18. Let's read. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there was in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your mat, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.' They asked him, 'Who is this man who said to you, Take up your bed and walk?' Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, 'See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you.' The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, 'My Father is working until now, and I am working.' This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." So the first obstacle I want to look at with you this morning, the first obstacle that can make you miss what God is doing, is to be saddled by superstitions. All right? Saddled by superstitions. Now, what do I mean by superstitions? Well, let's call out a few of these superstitions that we're familiar with, right? So I think the big one that everybody kind of probably thinks of first, or at least second, is the rabbit's foot. All right? There are a lot of people who believe that if you take this poor bunny and chop off one of his feet and make him run away with three legs, and you keep that foot, that foot will bring you luck. And my mom had a rabbit's foot, I remember, as a kid, and I thought it was the weirdest thing ever, but we had a rabbit's foot in our house. But some people believe that a rabbit's foot equals luck. Okay, another one would be the four-leaf clover. When I was a kid, we had a patch of four-leaf clovers growing right down the street from my house, about a half a block away. And I can remember going with some of my friends, and we would pick four-leaf clovers. And for a time, at least in my life, I believed that if I kept that four-leaf clover close, then I would have good luck. And I can remember picking through clover sometimes to try to find a four-leaf clover. What about, maybe you've heard of athletes and their lucky underwear. You ever heard that one? There are a lot of athletes who have lucky underwear. I don't know how you get the idea in your head that your underwear contributes to success, but there are many athletes who they'll win a game and they get in their head like, hey, it must have been the underwear. So they don't wash the underwear, they throw it in the gym locker. The next game rolls around, they put it back on, and somehow they think it's going to cause them to win. All right? Patrick Mahomes is a believer in lucky underwear. I even heard that Serena Williams had a pair of lucky socks that she would wear, and she would wear that same pair of socks throughout an entire tournament without washing them. And so this is a thing with athletes, lucky underwear, lucky socks, whatever. Being from New Orleans, I'm sure we've all seen this one. The St. Joseph statue. You turn it upside down, you bury it in your yard when you're trying to sell your house. And the belief there is maybe this statue will help you to sell your house faster. So these are all superstitions. We recognize, hopefully, that all of these are what we would call superstitions. But what actually is a superstition actually? All right, so let's come up with a good little baseline definition. A superstition is any type of, it is a widespread but unjustified belief in a supernatural cause of some event or some activity based on something you would do or some item that you would have. All right, so a widespread but unjustified belief in a supernatural cause of an event or activity. That would be a good definition for a superstition. And all of these things we just looked at are examples of superstitions. We actually encounter a superstition in the first 9 verses of this gospel story today. We see in verse 1 of the text that Jesus goes up to Jerusalem because it's time for a feast. All right, so I just said a moment ago that we're entering the festival cycle of the gospel now. And so in verse 1, when you see the word feast there, just know that the word feast and the word festival are basically interchangeable. The idea here is it is a religious festival taking place in Jerusalem, and Jesus, being a Jewish male, is going up to this religious festival to take part in it. And that's what we see in verse 1. Verse 2, it mentions that he he passes by what's called the Sheep Gate, which would have been an entrance or a gate into Jerusalem, somewhere around the northeast section of the city. And near that Sheep Gate, there is a pool. The pool is called Bethesda. The pool has how many? 5 roofed colonnades. And if you're not sure what that means, or if you're having trouble picturing it, just think of basically a covered walkway. A walkway with a cover over it, and that cover is supported by columns. And that is what we would call a colonnade, or your translation may even say a porch. Same difference, okay? So there's 5 of these around this pool. And now if I can just kind of pause for a second and give you a little fun fact, if you were here for our Christmas Eve service, I talked about this pool then too during that message, and this might ring a bell. Because for the longest time, the existence of this pool, this was one of the things that critics to our faith, skeptics, people who are trying to disprove our faith and poke holes and say things like, don't you know that the Bible is full of mistakes? This is one of the stories they would point to. And the idea was there was no known Jewish pool with 5 colonnades. None had ever been discovered. There were no records of any outside of this Bible story. It was believed to be fiction. And so they would point to this story and say, see, there's another error in your Bible right there. But then do you know what seems to happen every single time somebody says something like that? Archaeology comes along or science comes along and completely validates us. Because sometime in the 1800s, guess what happened? We discovered the pool. Like, we now know where this pool is. It was discovered. It was excavated. There's a church in Jerusalem, the Church of St. Anne, and right next to this church, you can go visit this pool today. It's several feet below ground level, and that's just because of the centuries and centuries of building and rebuilding. But it's there, and it's been excavated. And guess how many colonnades it has? It has 5. It has 5. It was a double pool, we now know, and it was surrounded on 4 sides by colonnades. And the 5th one went right down the middle and basically divided the pool into 2 sections. So you can right now, if you had the desire to do it, you could go to Jerusalem, you could visit this exact pool where Jesus was. Like, we know this is the pool now. But you could go visit it. This is where Jesus walked. And in verse 2, that's what he does. He walks up to this pool. And he comes up, and it's quite a scene, actually. It's quite a scene. There's all these people lying around. The text calls them invalids, people who are paralyzed, who are blind, who are lame. There's all these people who are just suffering all these misfortunes. They're all just lying around this pool. And we don't know why. It's Jesus' prerogative, but he zeroes in on this one guy who's been paralyzed for 38 years. And he zeroes in on him and he says, do you want to be saved? Do you want to be healed? And that's where we get the superstition. The guy says, well, how can I? I have nobody to lower me into the pool. And whenever I try, somebody else always gets to the pool before me. And so what he's actually alluding to there is a superstition that they held in the 1st century that was common to these people. We now know, or we strongly believe, that this pool was fed by a spring water source. And at certain times, when the water level got high enough, the spring water would rush in, and it would cause a phenomenon that looked like the water was being stirred. But they didn't know what that was, so these people had this superstition that there was an angel who came and stirred the water. And the superstition went that if you were lucky enough to be the first one to get into the water when the angel was stirring it, you would be healed of whatever was wrong with you. You would just be healed. And this poor guy, he's paralyzed. He can't get to the water. You think somebody's going to help him when they're trying to get to the water themselves? So he just sits there and never is the one to get to the water. So he says, how can I? I can't get to the water. And if we can just kind of park on that for a second, I just want to throw up a number. 0. 0 is the number of stories in the Bible where an angel is ever said to have healing powers and an angel is ever healing somebody. There are no stories in the Bible There is no biblical basis. There is no biblical warrant. There is no biblical case to be made for an angel healing anybody. One person heals, and it's God. But yet, I can remember as a kid, I can remember seeing infomercials for, hey, send your money to this address, and we'll send you this vial of water from this grotto. And this water was blessed by this angel or this patron saint or whoever, and you can pour it on your wounds and your wounds will be healed. I remember seeing those infomercials. Or what about the prayer cloths? You can send in to this television evangelist and he'll send you a prayer cloth, and that prayer cloth will work miracles in your life. I just want to park on that for a second and say, look, 100% of those are going to be scams. There's no grotto water that's going to heal you. There's no angel that blessed any water that's going to heal you. I just want to warn you and encourage you, please do not be taken in by anything like this. If there's really somebody out there who has the gift of healing and he can just heal people by touch, I'll just go ahead and quote Robbie Gallaty, because I listen to a lot of Robbie Gallaty sermons, and I was listening to him talk about this recently. If there really is a guy like that out there, and you hear him and you read books and stuff like that, and they're like, oh yeah, we can heal and all that, why aren't you at St. Jude Hospital healing all those kids? Why are you on TV asking for money? So I would be very, very skeptical. So please don't get taken in by these claims of some miracle product that was blessed by a patron saint or blessed by an angel, and it's going to give you some kind of healing powers. These are what we call superstitions for a reason. All right, and that's what we encounter here. And knowing what we know, it's probably a good thing that he didn't have anybody to help him into the water, because if this poor guy had fallen into the water in his condition, his legs would have been the least of his problems. Can we just be honest about that? That would have been the least of his issue. But what's really sad is the fact that he seems to have just accepted his fate. Notice he didn't ask Jesus for help. Jesus offered it to him. And at the end of the day, guess what? It was only Jesus who could. It was only Jesus who could help him. Not some magical water, not some angel with healing powers. This story, though, is proof that superstition can, and it often does, invade religion. In fact, that's a big reason why some people outside of our faith community think that that's all we are, is a superstition. Because it often does invade into religion. Hey, growing up in New Orleans, I can tell you, there was a time in my life when I thought holy water had supernatural powers. I thought it did. There was a time in my life when I thought that the statues of saints actually watched over me and kept me safe. There was a time in my life when I thought if I prayed with a set of rosary beads in my hands, then that somehow made my prayers louder and God heard me more than he would without the rosary beads. There were times in my life when I thought that certain furniture in the church building was sacred and had some sort of special powers. It wasn't, and it didn't. But these are all just different superstitions that people hold on to. I remember as a kid being forced to bow down to statues. We were instructed, you bow down when you pass this statue. I can remember all of these things. The problem with these superstitions is that they misdirect our focus. They take our focus, they take our devotion, they take our allegiance, and it refocuses it onto physical objects. And next thing you know, we're focusing on that object instead of God. Just so we're clear, none of these physical objects have any supernatural power whatsoever. None. Please make sure that your attention and your devotion is always focused where it needs to be, and that is on God. All right, so Psalm 121. I'll quote this for you, and then we're going to move into the second objection, the second obstacle. But Psalm 121, you've probably heard this, verses 1 and 2. It says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Right? Not any of the things on earth that have been miraculously or magically blessed. Not from anything on earth, but from the Lord who made the heavens and the earth. That is where our help comes from. A second major obstacle to recognizing what God may be trying to do is to become trapped by traditionalism. We see this in the second half of verse 9 up to verse 13. Let's reread that real quick just to make sure it's fresh in our minds. From the second half of verse 9 down to verse 13. It says, now that day, the day Jesus healed the man, was the Sabbath. Uh-oh. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. But he answered them, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. They asked him, well, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? Now, verse 13, the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. So Jesus performed this amazing miracle. He healed this man who for 38 years was paralyzed. Or at the very least, he couldn't walk. For 38 years, I guess that's the same thing. But for 38 years, this man had this condition. And Jesus just miraculously healed him. But notice that the religious leaders were so blind to what was happening. They completely missed it because, whoops, it was Saturday. It was the Sabbath. And that was a problem for them. How dare you pick up your own bed on the Sabbath? Let's take a moment and talk about why. All right, let's talk about what is the Sabbath anyway. What even is that? Okay, so some of this might be somewhat new information for some people. But way back in Genesis chapter 2, after God finished creating everything, okay, on the seventh day, just like we just saw in Psalm 121, who made heavens and earth, but just after he had finished creating the heavens and the earth, he rested. He created for 6 days, and he rested on the seventh. Because he was tired? No. Because he needed to catch his breath? No. Because he needed a break? No. Because he was done. He spent 6 days creating, and now it was time to sit back, evaluate the creation, see that it was very good, and appreciate what he had done and appraise it. And that's what we see him doing on the seventh day. And then and enjoy it. And then in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, it says he blessed the seventh day and made it holy. But it doesn't really go into any more detail than that. It's not until Exodus 31, many moons later, Exodus 31, that God finally hands down the law to Moses pertaining to the Sabbath. And that is where he tells him that the nation of Israel is to set aside the seventh day in remembrance of what God did, set it aside and do no work on the Sabbath. That's when he hands that down, which, by the way, is what the word Sabbath means. The Hebrew word for Sabbath literally means to cease or to desist. It means to stop. That's what Sabbath is. So interestingly, though, and this might be some new information, there's a case to be made. We're not going to deep dive into this right now, but there's a case to be made based on other Old Testament passages that the prohibition against working on the Sabbath, it really just had to do with conducting business. It had to do with that it had only to do with conducting business transactions. All right, so there's a case to be made. I'm not going to argue that case right now, but I've heard that case made, that it wasn't like you can't do anything on the Sabbath, but it was rather you don't conduct business on the Sabbath. But anyway, whatever. Over time, though, what happened, though, is the religious leaders got so hung up on this idea of work and what constitutes work that they felt the need to define that term. And they started coming up with additional rules and requirements based on what they thought constituted work and what didn't. And that's where we get this idea of things like, you ever heard the term a Sabbath day journey? Sometimes we see that in the Gospels. Jesus went a Sabbath day journey wherever. So that's where this idea came up, and this is not in the scriptures. This is just what they made up, that on the Sabbath you could walk up to 1,000 steps outside of your home before it was considered work. So you were fine up to step number 1,000. If you took one step beyond that, you just crossed into sin. Now you're working. So I guess really you can't go more than 500 paces outside of your house because you got to take into account that you got to get back. But this was an idea they came up with. But what's even weirder than that, sorry to say weird, but whatever. What's even weirder than that is this whole, then they started coming up with ways to get around it. So you could actually go on Friday and bring your food to somebody's house. And if you brought enough food to constitute a meal, then on the Sabbath, you could go get your food. And because your food was in this other house, you could argue in a technical sense that this was an extension of your house because this is where you're eating your meal, and that wouldn't count against your steps. So they started coming up with all these workarounds to even, they went to all the trouble of coming up with these rules, and then they immediately started coming up with workarounds. Today, there are Jewish people in Israel. I say this not to poke fun. There are people in Israel today who, on Friday night, will pre-tear all of the tissue paper that they think they need on Saturday because they think that tearing tissue paper constitutes work. And so they try to anticipate how much tissue paper will I need tomorrow, and they will tear it in advance and set it aside. Maybe they store it next to the lucky underwear. I don't know. But that's where it goes. It goes aside somewhere. And again, I mean, no disrespect to them, but they sincerely believe that if they get caught in the bathroom on Saturday and they don't have any tissue paper ready to go, their only option is to use what they need and then just throw the roll away because they can't tear it. So they will actually do this. And this is going on today. And again, no disrespect, but in all seriousness, I don't think God was worried about tissue paper when he set these laws in motion. That's not what the Sabbath laws was meant to be all about. But they took it and they kept running with it and adding their own restrictions on top of it. And just to be clear here, Jesus never violated any of God's laws. I want to stress that fact. Okay? He never violated any of God's laws. Our entire faith is based on the premise that Jesus perfectly fulfilled the law. Jesus never violated any of God's laws, but at the same time, Jesus never bound himself to the traditions of man. And there's a big difference. There's a big difference. Jesus never violated God's law, but he never bound himself to the traditions of people. But this is the kind of thing you get when traditionalism takes over. Okay, so this would be a good time to define some terms real quick. A tradition is a practice or a behavior that is passed down from person to person, generation to generation. Basically, it is inherited behavior. That is what a tradition is. And a lot of times, we don't even know why we're doing the tradition. We're just doing it because we've always done it, but we don't even know why. And let me say this. At the same time, I want to say this. Traditions are not automatically bad. Traditions are not inherently bad. In fact, we can't not have traditions. We can't not have traditions. If we made it a point to change every single thing every single day of our lives, guess what? We just started a new tradition of change, right? Like, we cannot avoid traditions, and they're not inherently bad. But a funny thing happens with traditions. A funny thing has a way of happening with traditions, especially inside the church. Especially inside of churches, because people can become so devoted to the tradition that the tradition basically becomes an idol. That is very common. And that's more or less what traditionalism is. A traditionalism is when you get so hung up on the traditions that you become resistant to change of any sort. Because no, we have to preserve the tradition at all costs. And this, again, this is a big danger for anybody, but especially within the churches. Because in the churches, what happens is we start to associate our particular traditions with the worship of God. And in our minds, the two get linked up. So much so that if somebody comes along and suggests changing the tradition or even doing away with the tradition, people recoil and they think in their minds that you've just insulted God himself. And that's why that's a particular danger in the church that you don't necessarily see outside the church, although outside the church, people also resist change. But within the church, it's because there's this link with the idea of our tradition with the worship of God. And that's what the Pharisees are doing in this story. That is what they're doing in this story. That's why they can't see past the fact that this healing just happened on the Sabbath. They can't see the great thing that happened because they're focusing on, wait a minute, you're carrying a mat on the Sabbath. Never mind the fact that you shouldn't be able to carry anything because I've been fasting you for 38 years and you've been lame on the side of the road. No. Let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the fact that you're walking around carrying a mat. That's what they're focused on here. And that's what they're doing. But churches need to get this. Churches have split over things like the color of the carpet because they couldn't agree. Churches have split over whether or not there should be drums on the stage. Churches have split over that. Churches have split over where to put certain pieces of furniture. All right, this is just, all of this is embedded in how churches operate a lot of times. We need to carefully distinguish the things we do that are actually of God and the things that we do that are just traditions. We have to have that distinction, and we have to keep that. Take evangelism, for example. Evangelism is of God, right? Evangelism is a non-negotiable. We should be doing evangelism, non-negotiable. But then, take something like the Lord's Supper, for instance, or how often we take the Lord's Supper. We do it monthly. Some churches do it quarterly. Some churches do it every week. That's a tradition. That can change. We can change that. And it doesn't mean that we just insulted God. That is something we can change. Saying the Lord's Prayer at the end of a church service. Singing a doxology at the end of a church service. Those are traditions. Those can change. Those can be changed. We have to distinguish between what is actually of God and what is a tradition. The religious leaders of Jesus' day were so preoccupied, they were so worried about making sure their traditions were being followed that they could not see God working right in front of their eyes. And if we're not careful, the very traditions we're clinging to will be the very things that make us miss what God is doing. We have to be careful about that. The third obstacle to recognizing the work of God is to be blinded by blasphemies. Let's look at verses 14 through 18 again real quick. Verse 14 says, "Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, 'See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you.' The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, 'My Father is working until now, and I am working.' This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God." So again, this third obstacle is when you're blinded by blasphemies. That's the third one. And ironically, this is one of the accusations that the religious leaders start lobbing at Jesus at this point. Blasphemy, blasphemy. And this is ultimately what's going to get him killed. Because they take all of these things he's saying as blasphemy. That's what's going to get him killed. But the irony in all of that, I would argue to you, is that they are so blind to the fact that Jesus actually is God in the flesh, God who has put on flesh and came to this earth to take away their sins. They're so blind to that when they attribute sin to Jesus, they're actually attributing sin to God. If you think about it, they're attributing the works of Satan to the works of God. And so the irony there is they're actually the ones blaspheming. They're lobbing these charges at Jesus, and they're the ones blaspheming God. They're the ones saying, "You're a sinner, you're a sinner." They're blaspheming the Son of God. Augustine, the famous church father, some St. Augustine, he had a great quote about these people. A great quote about this story and about these people. He said they sought darkness from the Sabbath more than light from the miracle. I think that's just a neat little quote. They sought darkness from the Sabbath more than light from the miracle. So let's break this down. Okay. First of all, I need to point out that it's not just the Pharisees who are blinded here. It's not just them. Up till now, we've been directing our criticism towards them. But this man that Jesus just healed, let's park on him for a second. We already covered the fact that he had basically kind of given into despair. He was sitting on the edge of that pool, and he had basically just given up. He was just sitting there. He did not ask for help. He waited until help was offered to him. Clearly, he ran off from that encounter with Jesus without even so much as saying, "Hey, stranger, what's your name?" Because he had no idea who Jesus was when the Pharisees questioned him. Maybe you caught that. He had no idea. He said, I don't know, just the guy that healed. The guy that took away my 38-year paralysis, he told me. Don't even know what his name is. When the Pharisees question him, he actually blames Jesus. Maybe you caught that. He pointed the finger back at Jesus and said, I mean, him. That guy did it. Go talk to him. He's trying to pass the buck and say, like, I'm innocent here. Go talk to him. And then later, when he finds out the identity of his healer, when he finds out who it was, when Jesus comes up to him in the temple, and he's like, oh, okay. He didn't have to do this. But he ran back to the religious leaders and ratted Jesus out. Did you see that? There was no reason he needed to do that. But as soon as he found out who it was, he ran back and said, hey, and he throws Jesus under the bus. So you may want to feel sorry for him because of his condition, but the gospel does not paint a very flattering picture of this guy. This is a guy who had given into despair, who did not take personal responsibility, and who was very, very quick to throw the guy who healed him under the bus if it got him out of trouble. So there's a lot going on here. And then you combine that with the fact that in verse 14, when Jesus finds him, he says, hey, you're well, but don't sin anymore, or something worse will happen to you. So there's obviously something more going on with this guy. And that's probably an allusion, if anything, to the fact that if he doesn't repent, if he doesn't come to faith, there will be eternal consequences for him. He's probably alluding to the fact that as of this point, he's not really seeing Jesus for who he is. But anyway, here's the progression of events. In verse 16, the text says, and this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. That's verse 16. And we've already seen why this was a problem. But verse 17 is what really caused problems for Jesus. Jesus said, my Father is working until now, and I am working. First of all, no Jewish person would have dared to call God my Father in this context, in this way. They might have said our Father, as in corporately, he's our Father, he's the Father of our nation. But to say he's my Father was just way too familiar and way too comfortable and way too personal. Like no, he's mine. He's my Father. They wouldn't have done that. And so that stands out here. It was just too personal for him. And you combine that, the fact that he would say this term about God that they wouldn't dare say, you combine that with the fact that he says this little bit about God always working. Now, here's a fun fact for you. And the Jews intuitively would have understood this. But God works on the Sabbath. You get it? Like when you have a prayer request on Saturday, you don't have to hold on to it till Sunday. Because he's not taking a break on Saturday. Right? Like you can bring your prayers to him on the Sabbath. He's still working. He's still taking prayer requests. The universe does not fly off into chaos because he stops maintaining the universe on Saturday. Like God works on the Sabbath. They got this. They got this. But for Jesus to say, my Father is always working and so am I, now he's equating himself. He's saying we're doing the same works and I'm just doing what he's doing. And so he's basically claiming divinity here. He's making himself equal with God. And now we're moving from you're a Sabbath breaker to you're a blasphemer. That's where we're going here now. In fact, we see that progression. Verse 16 says the Jews were persecuting him. And then verse 18 says they were trying to kill him. So from verse 16 to verse 18, things escalated quickly. Things escalated at that point. But that's not the only progression we see, because the paralytic superstition was a contributing factor to his blindness. And the Pharisees' traditionalism was a contributing factor to their I'm talking about spiritual blindness. The last thing we ever want to do is get so bogged down in these things that we completely miss what God is doing. He can be doing a great thing right in front of us, and we just miss it because we're bogged down with these false ideas. So, we've walked through all three of these things. What have we seen today? We've seen that God is always actively working, first of all, and yet, if we are saddled by superstition, if we are trapped by traditionalism, if we are blinded by blasphemy, we miss it. He's always working, but we miss it. And I want you to keep this in mind. A relationship is a direct connection between two people. That's what a relationship is. Religion is a man-made system of rules that are meant to appease a god or gods. They're not the same thing. A relationship is a direct connection. A religion is a man-made system of rules. I just want to be clear here. Jesus did not come here to start a religion. Jesus came here to promote a relationship. He did not come here to start a religion. But as we've seen time and time and time again, religion, even if it's a Christian spin on religion, can become a snare that pulls us away from God. If the actual devotion on our part is more to the superstitions and the traditions that arise within that religion than to Jesus himself. And that is always the danger. That is always the danger. I would argue that there are a great many people today who are following a set of traditions and a set of superstitions based on Christianity, but they're not actually following Jesus Christ. They're following the rules and the superstitions and the traditions. And they're not the same thing. I can sit in my garage and I can say, vroom, 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 and that does not make me a car. Or I can sit in that pew and say, amen, and that does not make me a Christ follower. In neither situation does that make me anything else. This is what makes me a Christ follower, right here. The fact that at a particular point in my life, I became aware of my own personal sinfulness and my own separation from God. I became convicted that Jesus really is the risen Christ and that he alone can forgive my sins. And then I asked him to forgive me of those sins and to come into my life and to lead me. And then I followed where he led. That is what makes anybody a Christ follower. Anybody. And where he led, I followed. The question isn't, do you go to church on Sunday? The question isn't, do you try to be a good person? The question is, have you asked Jesus to come into your life, to forgive you and to lead you, and have you committed to following him wherever he leads? That's the question. That's the question. Now, I failed to check this with y'all ahead of time, but can I get an instrumental on the piano for just a minute? Sorry, I didn't get it. I just want to get a little background music for a second because I can't preach a sermon like this without giving you an opportunity to respond. Even if nobody takes it, even if nobody needs to take it. But I just want to take a second and I want to ask if everybody in here would bow your heads and close your eyes for a moment. Right where you're sitting, nobody should be looking around right now. Nobody's eyes should be roaming the room. Okay? If you have never taken the steps in your life that I just described, I want you to know that Jesus' office is open 24/7 and there is no waiting. You can, right now, today, you can commit yourself to him and you can enter into eternal life with him today, right now. Here's my questions. Do you admit to do you admit to Jesus that you are a sinner, that you are separated from God by personal sinfulness? Do you believe that Jesus is exactly who he says he is, that he's the eternal Son of God, who came down from heaven, who put on flesh, who took on the sin of the world, who died in your place on a cross to take away the penalty of your sin? And if so, are you willing to hand your life over to him to do with as he sees fit and to follow his lordship? Can you answer yes to all of those questions, all three of those questions? And can you say yes knowing that the path of a disciple, it's not always easy, and there's always going to be a personal cost of some sort, which is why Jesus himself says to count the cost before you make the decision. Do not make a half-hearted commitment to him. If you can still say yes, please know that you can handle that with him anytime, by going to him in prayer and telling him all of that, and then committing to follow through. But today, right now, I want to personally invite you, if you've never asked Jesus into your life to forgive you and to make you his, what we would call professing faith, if you have never professed faith, as we call it, and you would like someone to help you with that and pray with you to receive Christ, I want to give you the invitation I'm right here. And I would like to invite you, if you would. You can do this again right where you're sitting, but I would invite you, if you choose, to come forward, and I will pray with you. I will help you, and I will pray with you. I will turn my mic off, don't worry, and I will pray with you. Just to be clear, this is not a general prayer time. This is not, I have a prayer request, and I just want to pray for it. There's time for that. We offer time for that. This is specifically, if there's someone in here, and maybe there's not, but if there is someone in here who has never prayed to receive Christ, and you would like to do that right now, and you just want somebody to stand there and pray with you and help you with that, if there's anyone in here, while I wait just a minute,